Hello everyone. So I'm trying to make a second video as a follow-up of my previous video on the anti-CAA protest analysis that I did. Now, if you remember, for those who have watched my previous video, what I essentially tried to do was to give an introduction to structural and more fact-based analysis of a phenomena that you can pick in society, particularly in India, and how you can deconstruct some of these events and try and consolidate a summary out of what has happened. For those who have not watched my previous video, you do not necessarily need to go back to the previous one, because I would be actually trying to give a lot more detail about some of the ideas that I had tried to explore and introduce in the previous video. But basically, just as a summary so that we can have a good start, what I tried to do was, first of all, with regards to the anti-CAA protests, I tried to point out the hypocrisies of the people who are trying to make a lot of money, fame, and validation out of this issue. Secondly, I talked about the absolute failure of communication and professionalism on the part of this government, who was not able to manage this issue, plan, and execute it in a much more rational and controlled manner that it could easily have, and then later went on to embarrass themselves in front of the media, giving vague statements. Specifically, the high point of the embarrassment being the Prime Minister having to come out and contradict his own employee, his own Home Minister, by saying that whatever he literally said about the NRC, we've not really discussed it. He just said it because he wanted to say it. And then lastly, I talked about the issues I had with the protests themselves. What kind of messaging the protests were pointing out to, the lack of an objective question that they were posing to the government, and how it was more of an anguish and a confused message that was being put out. Now, what I'm corely going to focus on this video is understanding the motivation and larger ideology of the protesters and the overall political game. Now, I'm no political pundit. What I'm basically trying to do is just take parts of different events that have happened and try to put the dots together and do my best. This is not a perfect analysis. This is not an expert's view. It is just an analyst's view who's trying to put all of this data together and understand, try and connect games. What I would really like from people who want to listen to me and like what I say is give me feedback and try and participate in this discussion more, so that more and more conversations can be brought in, more and more point of views. Criticism, I love it. Give it to me. Give me more data. Give me more ideas to support it so that we can build a larger model, a much more comprehensive model of understanding. So, but before we dive into the deeper ideology, let us draw a contrast between what have been some of the successful protests that have happened in the recent past in India and how they, pan up when it comes to this particular protest. So, one of the most recent and successful political protests that comes into mind was the India Against Corruption movement, led by Anna Hazare and executed by Arvind Kejriwal. Now, I'm not an Arvind Kejriwal supporter. I have been as one of his harshest critics, but I do always give him the credit for leading a successful political protest and a movement. It may not have been able to achieve all of its objectives that were set out for, which is very rare in a democracy to happen anyway, because you set out with certain objectives, but what you end up achieving is basically a shift in the balance of ideas. What the India Against Corruption movement led by Kejriwal was able to do was to able to start conversations and start a thinking of bringing accountability into politics. And I know that we still are not 100% there when it comes to our society wanting our politicians to be accountable, but at least the momentum has started. We are seeing more and more people trying to go out for politicians who work for them and try and ask them questions. But if you look at it very closely, what is the core difference between that protests and these anti-CAA protests? That protest was a protest against corruption, where the leaders of those protests were very clear about what they wanted. They have the draft ready for a legislation. They had clear objectives that they wanted to achieve. They had representatives who were very willing to participate in a dialogue with the government, although they were putting pressure, but that's how protests are. But they knew that their end goal was to have a dialogue with the government and push them into bringing about a legislation that will be brought into the parliament and be ratified, which did happen with whatever version of the Lokpal bill that came out. But what I'm trying to emphasize on is how that protest was very well organized. It had a structure to it, and it had a constructive goal to take India ahead. A lot of people may disagree with what the actual efficacy of that bill would be. I am particularly a big critic of the idea of an ombudsman, but you can't stop people from bringing forth their ideas and pushing into public, because ultimately, like I say, in a free marketplace of ideas, the best idea is going to win. But a bad idea can still create chaos and motivate people in a wrong way, which is exactly what these protests are doing. Now, if you really look at it, yes, there is one thing that I would definitely like to say, that India Against Corruption movement was more about a generic protest against the corruption that was there. It was not against a law or a bill that was brought about into the parliament. It was not against the law. It was trying to bring the law in. Here is a very unique situation where there are protests going on against a bill that was introduced in both houses of the parliament and got ratified with 2/3 majority and has become a law. Now, like I said in my previous video, there is no precedence of the government taking back a law, or unless it is challenged in the highest courts of the country and the courts quash that law on the basis of lack of adherence to the constitution. That is something that we need to realize here. Where are these intellectuals talking about the legislative fights that they're fighting? Where are the Kapil Sibbals or the Prashant Bhushans trying to challenge the government on the letter of the law itself that has been written? Because I remember whenever there is an actual agitation against a proposed legislation or even a law, these guys would be at the forefront leading cases in the Supreme Court, which I'm sure they are, but something tells me that they do not have the energy this time to actually challenge this in the court of law, because maybe there is not much to be challenged, and that's a different debate altogether. We might, I'm not a constitutional law expert, but whatever I've read, and I would like to point out that if you really want to understand whether this law is going to be constitutionally valid or not, whether the Supreme Court is going to take it heads on and reject it, you've got to listen to what Harish Salve, the former Attorney General of India, had to say about the validity of this law. He's very clear in his opinion that this is a perfectly valid bill and there is no way that it is unconstitutional. And maybe if you guys want me to do a video on that, trying to break down the specifics of the Citizenship Amendment Bill, I might do that in the future. But I'd like to move on and now dive deep into the protests themselves. Now, here's my subjective understanding. I think that this particular movement is modeled upon the Black Lives Matter movement that we saw 4 or 5 years ago in the United States. Now, the Black Lives Matter movement was against police brutality that was seen in series of events that took place in the southern United States. And there were specific demands from the protesters, although some of their rhetoric was also very toxic. And there was a lot of criticism of that movement as well. But at the same time, that movement was very, very aggressive. And yet at the same time, they still had very clear objectives as to what they wanted to achieve. This movement seems to be what I want to call it, the vacuous version of the Black Martyrs' Life movement in terms of its modus operandi. Once again, where are the intellectuals that are talking about specific problems with the legislature? Where are they talking about some of the facts in the bill? We don't see any. This is, as many leaders of this particular protest are calling it, A case in point being Anurag Kashyap and what he said yesterday when he was out there in Jamia Millia, and he said he was talking to the protesters and trying to give them more direction as to where they're headed. This seems to be a large, in their own head, a large, long, continuous struggle for the rights and respects for the Muslims of India. I particularly do not have a problem against such a movement. I think it's great, but the way they're doing it, we'll see some of the motivations behind that. But what is very clear to understand, and what for everybody needs to kind of recognize, is that it is not a single point movement against the CAA or the NRC or the NPR. This is a combination which is the major trigger for a series of issues that have happened in the past 1 year, where there wasn't any organized successful protests. What are some of these issues that this led to this trigger? Number one, the Triple Talaq bill. Number two, revocation of the Article 370, and finally, the cherry on cake, the Supreme Court's decision on the Ram Mandir issue. Now, don't get me wrong when I try to say that these are the issues that led to a bubbling of anger, anxiety, and anguish amongst the Muslims. When I say that, I am not trying to question the allegiance, the ethics, or the motivation of a common average Muslim out there in the street trying to protest these things. What I heard from a motley of different discussions, when a lot of common Muslims were asked about all these three issues, there was a pretty good variance of opinions. Majority of them being, if the government of the day has decided that these things, such as the Triple Talaq, is unconstitutional, or the Ram Mandir has been approved by the Supreme Court, or the Article 370 has been removed, it has been done for the good of the nation. And whether we like it or not, we're not going to protest about it. But some people were really, really unhappy about that, because they had been for years thinking of utilizing these movements whenever they came in history to create chaos, to create a civil war-like situation, and to create a political movement that can challenge the BJP. Nothing of that sort happened. And then the BJP pressed harder, with its bravado and its poor communication, brought out these ideas of the NPR and the NRC and the CAA, and the people who wanted to capitalize on the anxieties of the common Muslim were able to do so when they found that this is the kindling moment where they can lit the fire. So we've talked about some of the motivations, but let's look at what kind of people are the intellectual base behind these anti-CAA protests. I have categorized them into 4 categories. Number one, chiefly the Islamists, and I'll go deeper into what they are. The ultra-leftists, celebrities and artists, and the larger anti-BJP opposition parties, chiefly the AAP and the Congress. Now, who are the Islamists? There is a larger discussion on what Islamism is, Islamists are, and adherents of Islam are. But just broadly speaking, I look at Islamists as people who believe in the hardcore political ideology of Islam and want and do not accept democracy as the best form of governance in India. They look at India's history from a very different lens. They have been heard so many times talking about how Muslims used to lead this country, and this country cannot be led by a Hindu majority or a democracy because their form of governance is the best form of governance. And if all of the country cannot come under Islamic law, then at least the Muslims should be allowed to utilize Islam as their own law and not the law of the land. This is how I like to categorize the Islamists. Why are they behind these anti-CAA protests? And why are they one of the biggest intellectual forces behind these protests? Because it serves them very well politically. they have always tried to be in cahoots with the governments, trying to be the representatives of the Muslims, where they manipulated both sides. And this gives them the perfect opportunity to control the average anxiety of a Muslim, where they're telling those people that, look, we've been telling you that the Indian state, the Indian government, the Hindu majority has always against you. We've been trying to tell you that these things are going to come where an average Muslim is going to be disenfranchised from the state, and there is going to be massive crackdown against an average Muslim. And look, this is what's happening. And this is the perfect moment. This is the golden opportunity to capitalize this situation. The ultra-leftists. Less said about them, the better. They don't believe in the idea of India, in my opinion. Their idea of India is something very, very different. We'll probably do a video about them sometime later. But they will basically align with any force that basically talks about creating more and more fissures and the destruction of India. So they're the parasites who will stick to a pathogenic wound and try and eat off whatever nutrients they want to take away from them. Sorry. Celebrities and artists. What to say about them? The brilliant Deepika Padukone came to these protests, started standing next to people like Kanhaiya Kumar, not even understanding what they were trying to say. A lot of people said, you know, her PR agency asked her to be there because it would have been a great thing for her movie. This is how celebrities and artists like Deepika Padukone and some of these people who don't even have the time in their lives, and bless their souls. I mean, think about it. I don't expect them to be analysts. I don't understand these people to be very well read because they don't have the time to do it. I mean, their schedules are so busy that they don't have the time to actually sit down and think critically about what's happening in the country. They'll latch on to the next opportunity that is going to help them connect with the image that they're trying to portray to sell their next movie. But there are still some artists and celebrities who claim themselves as intellectuals. And some of them who I've been a big fan of. Chiefly Anurag Kashyap. And it is very curious as to how he's going on a rampage against this government. Talking one rhetoric after another with zero facts, zero availability of any critical analysis and what these protests are going to do. How do they hold in the larger context of the various legislations are coming? Whether not even trying to give 1 ounce of a benefit of doubt to the government or the general Indian state that has actually created these legislations. Now remember, it is not the government or these ministers like Amit Shah and all of these people who actually bring ideas to the table. It is the larger Indian state, the bureaucracy that has been working over series of legislations that these big secretaries draft up and they present to whoever is in power and see if that can be ratified. It's not a BJP idea. I mean, if you remember what Manmohan Singh had said in 2003 when the first CAA or Citizen Amendmentship Act was what brought about when LK Advani was the Home Minister, his claim or his request from the government at that time to provide a safe haven and citizenship to refugees, Hindu and other minority refugees coming from Afghanistan, Pakistan and Bangladesh, and giving them shelter in India, that request is no different from what the current bill is. And more interestingly, the first citizenship amendment bill in 2003 that was drafted, that drafting committee was headed by Pranab Mukherjee. It had Kapil Sibal in that committee. So let us not be under this impression that this is a BJP legislation. It is a legislation that the Indian state has always wanted for a long time. But here's my last little dive into the overall political game. Why is the BJP doing it now? And why is it doing it in the manner it is doing it? Two things. The timing of it. So, what is BJP's next big frontier? What does it want to capture? Where does it want to create a stranglehold? Everybody knows it. It's Bengal. The CAA is chiefly not centered around Pakistan. It has everything to do with Assam and Bengal. They're already in power in Assam and they want to capture Bengal. Bengal is going through a point in its history where the Hindu majority there is trying to wake up to the realities of demographic change that's happening in Bengal. I'm not giving a political opinion about it. I'm not saying yes or no. I'm not saying whether demographic change is good or not. But there is anxiety. And BJP is tried to capture that anxiety, and it will keep hankering over this issue till the Bengal elections come. That is why at this point of time they brought in this legislation. They brought right after the NRC became unsuccessful. And I do believe and I do agree with the critics of the BJP who say that this is chiefly about the elections in Bengal. I do think that that is true. However, can we question the morality of a government which is just trying to bring in legislation that has always been talked about and is in the works and has drafts available and previous amendments been passed? I don't know. Sometimes you have to bring it. But the timing is a political game. Secondly, I wondered, because I always thought, and I spoke about the previous video, why was the messaging that was done by people like Amit Shah so aggressive, so full of rhetoric, so full of narebazi, and so full of bravado, so full of that boasting aggression? I think apart from what they want to do in the Bengal elections, it is bringing about an environmental change for the introduction of the Uniform Civil Code. I think the lot of capturing of this data, of understanding Muslim demographics, understanding how Muslims perceive different issues by gathering that data is extremely important for the drafting of the Uniform Civil Code bill. That has been their biggest agenda ever since the party started. And it's a matter of a different discussion. But if you think about from an analyst's and a policy drafter's point of view, no policy is created without proper data and research. When you're trying to do something like a Uniform Civil Code, you cannot just draft that bill in isolation in a meeting where you have 7 people sitting and writing that bill. That's not how it works. You need data. You need an understanding of what Muslim perceptions are. You need to know how many illegal people have entered in this country. And why am I focusing on Muslims? Is because, unfortunately, although the Uniform Civil Code will have a lot of ramifications on other communities as well, but it is chiefly a Hindu-Muslim issue, which we need to recognize in the larger political game and context. So no policy, something as big as the Uniform Civil Code, can be brought about without a gigantic amount of data analysis and understanding, which can only come about when you have protections put in place for some of the refugees that you want to bring in. You have a framework that tries to deal with illegal Muslim immigrants in this country who are perceived as demographic changers. And lastly, just to understand how an average Muslim lives his life. That's the data the government needs chiefly to create the Uniform Civil Code, in my opinion. But there is one more little thing that I want to talk about. A lot of people say that the BJP is an anti-Muslim party. A lot of people say the BJP is an anti-Islam party. A lot of people these days say BJP is an anti-Islamism party. Hindutva is a response to Islamism. RSS is a response to Islamism. There is a semblance of truth to every one of those points. Anybody who claims that it's not is either a part of the BJP or a BJP's representative, or is lying. There's no 3 ways about it. There's no 2 ways about it. But is it truly wrong for a political party to be anti-Islam, to be anti-Islamism, or to be generally critical about how a particular community lives in this country? If a political party, through democratic means, wants to nudge a particular community into nation building as a larger project, I don't see anything wrong with that from their point of view, from the point of view of the rights that are available for them to create a movement behind it. The BJP wants to straighten Muslims out. The BJP wants its nudge politics to show its overall dominance as the Hindu majority. Now, whether it keeps doing it through democratic means and whether they have an overall secular objective is a matter of contention. And I am somewhere in the middle of that. This is a comprehensive picture that I painted. And lastly, what's the way forward for well-meaning students of Indian society and culture from all of this? I think all of us who really want to understand and make a difference need to go into the details of issues. Let's look at facts. Let's start and expose hypocrisies and factual flaws on both sides. Let us challenge rhetoric, subjective language, confusing narratives, deliberately muddling ecosystems that are created to create confusion, and narebazi on both sides. Let us question it unequivocally, brutally, and systematically. Finally, ask for solutions. If somebody says, I don't like this part of my country, I don't like this idea, I hate this, I hate that. Okay, what's your solution? What do you think can be done differently? And that's where this protest will fail. Because at the end, it's not providing a solution. All it is a big ego show for the people who are there protesting, who are saying things like, प्रधानमंत्री को हमसे आके मिलना चाहिए भाई, हमें तो आदत पड़ी हुई है कि हम जब भी धरने पे निकलते हैं तो नेता हमारे पास आके नीचे बैठते हैं और हमारी बात मानते हैं. That's the thing. Protesters need to educate themselves, and the politicians need to become more accountable. And people like you and me who try and understand and deconstruct these issues need to break things that are confused, that are muddled apart, expose hypocrisies, bring in data, and challenge every confused subjective narrative. Thank you. I hope you liked the video, and please let me know in the comments, share and subscribe, and give me your feedback. Have a good one.